Hey, welcome all you wiretappers out there. I'm here on the Skype line and in the office in the studio with my good friend Cam Robinson from Munster, Indiana. Did I get that right, Cam?
You got it right, Gary. You got it right.
I was just going back and editing that one where we were teasing about all the horrible drivers from Illinois. I've got that up yet, but I can hardly wait to put that up. And Ben Ellickson up there hears it because I know he's going to.
Hey, that bastard! And even from Chicago, you got him on this show.
Yeah, really. And we're denigrating Illinois drivers. That's what I'm thinking about. So anyhow, actually, I talked to Cam yesterday about coming up there, and looking forward to that. Folks, we're going to try to make a trip up to Chicago and meet with Cam and get on up into town and hit some mob sites and do some video at some mob sites. Talk to Mike Byrne of the, what's the name of that Facebook page? The Chicago Outfit Old and New Articles. Right.
He's got the headlines.
It's Chicago Outfit Old and News Stories, I believe. But you just go look at the Chicago Outfit Facebook pages. It's a really good one, folks. Mike really does a good job with that. I've talked to Frank Calabrese Jr. and told him I want to take his mob tour when I go up and meet up with him. Mike mentioned we could maybe just a bunch of people show up at maybe the Luna restaurant, which is a place that has a mob history. And there's been a couple others suggested to me, the Loon. And all of a sudden I forgot the other one. Ben suggested.
Rika Benny's was one of the places, right? Yeah.
Rika Benny's. You suggested Rika Benny's. So we just got to figure out what would be the better place to go and meet up and just shoot the shit, eat some pizza, or have some drinks and talk. And I don't really want to put on a program. I just wouldn't mind meeting some people in Chicago. I know this Mike McCollum, who I don't know very well yet. He's a former Hells Angels and lives in the suburbs of Chicago, working on his own book. He said he wants to jump on his bike, and I'm going to take my bike up and go around to the different mob sites with me, and he'll be my backup. He'll be my bodyguard when I go around these mob sites. If anybody wants to mess with me, they got to go through my man first. Like a real mobster.
Right.
Anyhow, moving right along, we're going to start talking about the Pizza Connection. This is going to be the first of a multi-episode series on the Pizza Connection. I got into this with this book. Let me find that book here. It is the last days of the Sicilians.
Sicilians, yeah.
Last days of the Sicilians, folks.
That was one of two books that came out, and that thing's really great, well reviewed. I mean, that's considered the top book on the subject.
Right. It was written by Ralph Blumenthal, who was a reporter for the New York Times, and I'll tell you what, after reading that book, they must have opened up all their files and sat and talked with him and really opened up with him. It was pretty amazing what the detail that he went into in that thing. Now the other books by this some kind of an editorial writer named Shana Alexander, and I think it's a little more.
Did not have the access.
Yeah, she didn't have the access, is my understanding. But this is a hell of a book. If you're interested in, and this is a really interesting, complex, fascinating case of the mafia and narcotics and transnational crime families working together, from South America to Sicily to Turkey to New York City to Pennsylvania, rural Illinois. I mean, it's kind of crazy if you think about it.
It's been five continents. I mean, because they had presence in Asia, North and South America, Europe, Africa. I mean, it was enormous what they were doing.
I had a class late in my career as a policeman by a futurist. And they talked about what the future of organized crime was going to be back then. And the Sicilian Mafia was still somewhat of a thing. But this guy said, no, he said, that's done. He said, it's the transnational gangs. It's going to be the Russians particularly. He didn't really realize how the Sicilians would then move into transnational transnational time, and I think maybe this pizza connection kind of knocked a lot of them out, because we're going to talk about what happened over in Sicily. They had a trial with like 500 defendants. They built a special prison around the courthouse, and then they just bring the prisoners in and hold them in holding cells that they could see, like that's how they attended their trial. And they would hoot and holler. And,
you see them throwing up the hand gestures and screaming. Yeah, it looks like Thanksgiving dinner at with my mother's family.
But the Carabini and the famous the big mafia fighter Giovanni Falcone, who ended up getting killed for his trouble, they really put a hurt on him over there in Sicily. But here we're going to start out today. This will be the first one. I call this the Pizza Connection, the beginnings. And let's just go back a little bit. The Sicilian Mafia, it goes clear back to the 1800s. And I've talked about this before with other people, other experts have filled me in on this. It really was formed to protect the local people on the island of Sicily from the central government in Rome, who were absentee landlords and kind of had screwed over the people, the peasants down there. And plus, Sicily has been invaded and dominated by how many different countries? A bunch of them around the Mediterranean.
Yeah, through the years, everybody, yeah.
So in the country, in the rural areas particularly, but all over, even in the Palermo, the bigger cities, they have created this almost like a shadow government that is going to protect the people. But they also, as a shadow government, they also kind of feathered their own nest all along the way. And in later years after World War II, they didn't have any central government really to be afraid of, particularly, that was going to rip them off. And
they didn't really have central government until about the turn of the 20th century, which is, I think, why you see all those groups in Italy. Is there was no until basically a little bit before Mussolini, when the first it was around the turn of the 20th century. That's why you've got the Neapolitans consider themselves a separate nation, and you go to Italy and they say, well, I'm from Florence, or I'm from here. They consider themselves Italian second. I guess they had to get used to that individual government on their own, which is kind of bears up to what you're saying.
No, that is interesting. I didn't really think about it quite about that these city states that they had all the way back to the Middle Ages were the people identified more with that city state.
Yeah.
Venice or Rome or Naples or whatever, you identify more than Sicily. You identify as a Sicilian rather than Italian. So I never thought about that. And so there's a pretty interesting story about Mussolini. Mussolini is the one guy that put the clamps down on the mafia. But it takes a fascist dictator to do anything like that.
If anybody's going to shut them down.
Which is why in this country we have huge problems with crime, because we don't have a fascist dictator that's willing to do what needs to be done. I told this young policeman once, he was complaining about some of the legal restrictions on cops, and I said, dude, if you guys could all do everything you wanted to do without any repercussions, you'd be wearing black leather boots up to your knees and wearing swastikas running around here and ruling, dominating people. That's just the nature of men. We need those controls. Law enforcement authority figures needs those controls.
Yeah, that self-restraint will only go so far in absolute power,
Yeah, well, absolute power corrupts absolutely in the end. But anyhow, Sicily, this story, kind of interesting story. Mussolini visited Sicily in 1924, and he passed through this one little town of Piana dei Greci. Would that be how you pronounce that? G-R-E-C?
Piana dei Greci. It'd be
Greci,
like
okay.
CH.
I see. Piana del Greci. And he was received by the local mayor, who was also the mob boss, or the mafia boss, which is kind of the way it was in those times. The city government and the mafia basically were all the same thing. Mm-hmm. He was the top politician in the town. He noticed the mayor, his name was Cuccia, he noticed that Mussolini had a big military escort and a lot of bodyguards. And they say he's whispered into Mussolini's ear, "You're with me. You're under my protection. You don't really need all these cops. Nobody's going to hurt you as long as I'm around." Mussolini didn't really like that, and rejected this offer of protection, and the mayor kind of felt slighted, and he was humiliated at the rejection by Mussolini. So he told all his people, just stay at home when El Duce makes a speech. And of course, when nobody shows up for El Duce's speech, Mussolini is humiliated, and he wants to get back. And they say that was the spark that started Mussolini's war on the mafia. And boy, he went after him. He granted special powers to all the police just to fight the mafia. He appointed one of his fascist supporters, a guy named Cesare Mori, to recruit a small army, they say, of carabini and militia officers. And they said they just went out in the countryside, rounded up anybody they thought might be a mafia member. And if they couldn't find them, but they had a name, they'd snatch the guy's relatives and hold them hostage, take their property, sell it, kill their livestock. They did that for 3 years straight, up to around World War II when it got started. They said they detained over 1,000 suspects. They used torture to extract confessions. Of course, pretty soon, some of the mafioso are complying with them, figuring that they'll get in with them and they'll give up some of their buddies. And it was bad.
I think we need to clarify. A lot of people think, oh, well, they're just criminals. But I mean, they weren't, in the old world, they weren't so much criminals per se. They were just sort of the local. I mean, it was corrupt, but they were also looking out for the people out in the country. That was the only law they had. And Mussolini wanted full control, and he didn't, like you said, he didn't like that anybody else had control. So these weren't like international drug runners back then. They were doing little criminal things, but he was just rounding up everybody, and it was it's a bad time to be Sicilian.
Really, and historically they've been smugglers. They smuggle cigarettes, they smuggled all kinds of stuff. An island and all that sea access, and so they've been smugglers for a long time, but just to avoid taxes. Of course, government doesn't like it when you avoid taxes. Now in this country, when you do that, they file a civil suit against you and attach your bank account or put a lien on your house or something. They don't clap you in jail and torture you.
Torture your family.
And torture your family and kill off your livestock because you cheated them out of some taxes. Yeah, it was quite a time for the mafia. And then after the war, it was Katie bar the door. I have to wonder, wasn't Lucky Luciano was over there during the war. He must have laid low and stayed, and Vito Genovese was over there during the war too. They must have really laid low.
Genovese had a relationship with Mussolini. This is when a lot of the southern Italians were coming over, and the Sicilians just mixed in with all the other. Like my family's southern Italian, and they came through Ellis Island. Well, this is just a lot of mafia. So there were a ton of Italians coming over anyway. There were a ton of everybody, Irish and everybody, and the mafiosi just came in with them. But then, like you said, Luciano got deported, so he was over there sort of laying low, and that was when Genovese was over there too. And Genovese ingratiated himself with Mussolini. There was a anti-fascist journalist named Carmine Tresca. And Carmine Tresca was in America. He was writing a bunch of anti-fascist newspapers and for all the Italians in America, talking about down with Mussolini, we've got to support the anti-fascist effort. And so in order to get sort of a pass, Genovese told Mussolini he could have Carmine Tresca killed. And it was your buddy Carmine Galante, who is known for having killed Carmine Tresca back. It was in the, I think it was would have been the 30s or the early 40s. I can't remember the year, but he was a very famous anti-fascist journalist, and that was how Genovese sort of got a pass to do a lot of things. Not only that, Genovese eventually allied himself with the Allies in the local war, but he was safe for the time being because he did this assassination for Mussolini. Oh
yeah, I bet when the Allies moved up Sicily, I bet all those mob guys all of a sudden were their best buddy. Right. As the Allies would have moved up from Sicily up the boot in the regular part of Italy, the main part of Italy, they would be arresting and knocking out local government officials and any policemen that might have been, fascist. And these mob guys are primed. They're ready. Okay, and they would have got a big boost out of that, I would imagine.
Absolutely.
Now, I did read that there were some positive there were some positive results out of this war on the Sicilian Mafia by El Duce. The murder rate sharply declined, and landowners actually did a little bit better because they were able to raise the rents on their land. The rents had been held to an artificially low amount by the mafia. The mafia controlled the countryside, and the landowners were not allowed to charge quite as much rent as they'd like to. Which they were taking care of the peasants over the landowners. It sounds to me like, but so landowners did a little better when Mussolini was in power. And that did. I have a friend here in Kansas City, and he said his dad was Italian, of course, and his dad would go around and pass out pamphlets to different people over in the Italian section that were like puff pieces or promotion of Mussolini and what a good guy he was and things like that. I'd never heard of that before. And this was, of course, before the war. This was in the late 30s. And so Mussolini himself had, one guy, he's over here in the United States writing articles against Mussolini, but he also had people putting out money over the United States trying to get the support of the Italians in America. So
and El Duce was popular in the beginning, so.
Yeah, he was. He made things better. He made the trains run on time, as they say.
Yeah, that's right.
So
they still don't do that in Italy.
and it was during this time, say in just before the war or during the war, that Niccolo. It was during this time that the Rizzuto family, Niccolo and Vito Rizzuto, came to Montreal from Sicily, and Carlo Gambino and Joe Bonanno came to New York City from Sicily, trying to get away from this purge.
They would have come right in the 20s, and Niccolo Rizzuto, probably his family would have fled around the 20s also.
And Carmine Galante, I think his family came over.
Yeah.
I don't know if and they were all from this one particular area primarily. It's Castellamare de Golfo, right. Thank you for the help with that. I have to put on my butcher's apron to say that one. But, and they formed these lifelong connections and friendships, even like this one guy that came over, Bonaventre. He got connected up with Joseph Proface. He was actually his uncle, and his daughter will marry Bill Bonanno, Proface's daughter. Carmine Galante moves in gets to know Bonaventre, and when he's looking for Sicilians to come over and work for him, what they would call zips. This Giovanni Bonaventre's son, Cesare Bonaventre, would be one of his bodyguards. So it was like these small town connections that everybody knew each other. And they're slowly but surely coming to the United States. And they had to come through a lot of these problems over in Sicily. But then when you got those kinds of connections that go way back, and intermarriage in the family and everything, you get a lot more loyalty out of somebody. You're not so worried about them turning on you.
Absolutely. I was reading recently about an LA mob boss in the 20s who was dealing with a guy from Kansas City and another guy from just all over the country, but just going to the same point, how they all immediately came over here, and before Luciano got everybody together, they all knew each other and they were all building toward that direction. I guess if you moved to China, you would know everybody from Kansas City in that area pretty quickly.
Now,
if you were in an expat community.
Yeah, really. Now they say that during the 30s, even Mussolini couldn't stop the smuggling. Like you said, it's an island. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of ways to smuggle stuff, and they had a long history, and they were smuggling opium from the Mideast back in those days, and through Europe to Cuba and Mexico for the American mafia families, and even Mussolini couldn't stop that. Prohibition gets over, and the American mob is looking for new sources of income, and gambling's kind of getting started. But back in the 30s, after Prohibition, everybody gets into narcotics. Every crime family. We have our local mob guy would come, or the brother to our local mob boss. They have him buying heroin or selling heroin in 1935 in a small amount of heroin. And they had I have a podcast with where we interviewed Bill Owsley about the whole history of heroin. We had quite a heroin distribution ring here in Kansas City, and they had it in all the major cities and east from Kansas City east.
First arrest was for heroin.
Right, and so there's a lot of money to be made in that. It all came in through Cuba after they smuggled it out of the Mideast, and so it's it's been around a long time. Now this is before the war. Now World War II happens. You know what happens in World War II in Europe, in the Mediterranean? Everything stops. Everything stops. If you don't have a gunboat, you don't have a destroyer or an aircraft carrier, everybody's fighting the war. It's the same way in the United States. I mean, crime kind of went on the down low, and there's no small crime, but everybody stopped and went into the war after. The same way in Italy and Sicily and all around the Mediterranean. Plus, there was military everywhere. But right after the war, these guys are ready.
And you have all the soldiers over there. You've got all the supplies. I mean, that's what Genovese was teaming up with the local mafia over there, and you've got everything.
And the big thing that developed, trying to show that they talk about the history of how this developed into this, what would become the pizza connection and resurgence of this heroin thing is. The big thing that developed right after the war was smuggling cigarettes. Cigarettes, wherever there's addiction, the mafia is going to be there because there's so much money to be made in it, whether it's gambling or sex or drugs or alcohol, whatever. The mob's going to be in there. So they started smuggling cigarettes. They'd go like these military bases. They'd have tons and tons and tons of Lucky Strikes,
American cigarettes,
Pell Mells, and of course you can always find a corrupt GI, a supply sergeant, and buy the cases and cases of cigarettes because they it just I knew a mob guy who told me about his little scams he ran during and right after the war. He was like he ran a snack shop on a ship that was going back and forth across the Atlantic with supplies and bringing troops home, taking supplies over, bringing troops home right at the end of the war. Right. And he had a scam going, boy. He ran the snack shop and he charged, he'd make payday loans and but what do you call those, loan shark loans to guys and run the gambling games on the ship, but he had quite a little racket going.
I knew somebody, she was non-mafia, and she had a racket going when she was running guard duty. She would, she basically set up, basically a hooch. She would set aside a room, and if people wanted to use it, men and women soldiers wanted to use it, could sneak away. Yeah. She would charge them for the privilege to sneak away into this room while she was on guard duty. I mean, so there's always an opportunity.
There's always an opportunity.
She had a matchmaking service too, I think, a political way of putting it.
So when you got all these cigarettes and they're smuggling them all over the Aegean, they'll get them out of maybe France or of a base in Italy, and they want to take them over to Albania or to Greece or Turkey and maybe on over to Spain, anything along the Aegean. That's where the term cigarette boats come from. They got these real fast, long, skinny boats. Right. They call them cigarette boats, not because they look like a cigarette, because they used to smuggle cigarettes in them. They were too fast for the taxing police. The Italians had this tax police that were supposed to, collect duties or enforce the collection of duties and taxes on imports and exports at the borders. And of course, that was, these guys have been doing that, going around those things for, 100 years or several hundred years by now.
Yeah, they had the practice.
So it's just, it's just an extension of that. They fell into it naturally. And by the 50s, heroin's starting to get popular again. All the GIs are back, and people are making money in the United States. Heroin's starting to regain its popularity after all that. Nothing could come in. There probably wasn't any heroin to speak of coming in during World War II. It was just too dangerous to try to take anything around it. So heroin's getting popular, and American mobs families are setting up these connections with their Sicilian buddies. Lucky Luciano's already set a bunch of them up, and with a meeting in what was it, late 1940s, I think. He had one meeting down in Havana.
Down in Havana, yeah. And they talked about a couple.
And so, the American mob just keeps operating under this fiction that they don't deal in heroin, they don't deal in narcotics. Yeah, right. On one hand, but on the other hand, there are certain ones that do.
Yeah,
and they never ever quit. And the Gambino family and the Bonanno family were the two main ones, and they've dealt in heroin all the way through. Probably Gambino's still dealing in it today. It's.
I sent you that picture, didn't I? It wasn't heroin, but it was the boss where he's got piles of marijuana, those big bales of marijuana, and he's standing with his arm around his grandmother.
Right. That was over in Sicily. Yes. So.
Yeah, I think you're right. The Bonannos are still knee deep in it.
Oh, and Gambinos for sure. See, they're
Gambinos too, absolutely.
They're ran by guys who were
Sicilians now.
They're run by the Sicilians. That Sicilian faction. They didn't get hurt so bad out of the pizza connection. It was a Bonanno Sicilian.
That's right.
Crews that got hurt so bad out of the pizza connection. Gambino's kind of slipped on through, but then during the 50s, the United States, we start seeing, how we are. We see a problem. We start seeing all this heroin and morphine and this attendant social problems showing up. Mm-hmm. Well, they pass a Narcotics Control Act, which gives long sentences, draconian sentences for, that was in 1956. And in 1957, that's when they had the Apalachian meeting, and they came out with this rule: you're not supposed to deal in narcotics, because they saw the danger in that, man. I tell you what, I saw this when we had the new crack cocaine laws, the kingpin laws in the 80s and 90s. Man, you can get a guy to tell on his mama when you're looking at a 30-year-old guy getting 50 or 60 years in the penitentiary for being a drug dealer.
Illinois always had really, really strict drug laws here, even predating the 56 Narcotics Control Act, and they were really strongly enforced. And I think if you look at a lot of the history of the outfit, heroin just didn't play a big role because there were mandatory minimum sentences. And in Illinois, that was one thing that Illinois was really keen on, was really enforcing the drug sentences, going back to the, I want to say it was 1938, I think, that it first went into effect. But they were really strict on the heroin enforcement.
So it's during this time that, as I mentioned, these two families, the Bonanno and the Gambino family, they got to see an opportunity. And it was 1956, Carmine Galante is found up in Canada doing crime and connected with the, actually that was the Brogadas. It was before the Rizzutos took over, and Sicilian mob took over in Montreal. But he's up there, got action going, and I'm sure he was setting up those supply routes from the Mideast through Mediterranean Sea to Montreal, and then down through upstate New York to New York. I'm sure that's what he's doing. He gets deported from Canada, and then we come up with the fiction. They create the fiction in 1957 that the mafia doesn't deal in narcotics.
Right.
The 1960s, the McClellan Commission, and it was really looking into labor racketeering, but also organized crime in America. They heard a lot of testimony about American mobsters being involved in narcotics, but and one of them that testimony was concerning was Lucky Luciano, who was still in exile in Sicily. You know, if you remember, he had agreed to help the government,
protect
the military,
the
protect the waterfronts, and then right after the war, his old nemesis, prosecutor Thomas Dewey, agreed that he could then be exiled or deported to Sicily, but he couldn't come back, and he wanted to
prison.
Yeah, he wanted to come back in the worst way, man. That was like 1946, and so 47. I can't remember the exact date that he got that, but it was after the war. And so by 1957, they're making these connections up. There was a big meeting at if you look around, you'll find a little bit about this in Palermo, where several American mob members went to Grand Hotel des Palmas.
Yeah.
And you know, that Tommaso Bruschetta was one that told us a little bit about that. You remember anything that remember what Bruschetta said?
Bruschetta said that was, as far as that meeting, he said that was kind of the little bit that's come out about that is there was, I guess, Joe Bonanno was there and Luciano was there and Galente was there and Badalamenti, who you've done a lot of work on recently, and that was where they started to initially set up some of the trade routes that they were gonna establish, basically from from Turkey is where the heroin was produced, and then they ship it through Marseille and France, where it would be processed, and then back to Canada in the St. Lawrence River, and so that was the original heroin route. There was the French connection prior to the pizza.
Right, and actually some of that, because there's French people involved. French had this big presence in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, and they were bringing white heroin out of the Golden Triangle. And so that was part of it too. When France lost Vietnam and moved out of Vietnam, then a lot of that dried up because of that also. Plus, Americans started getting their own connections over there because of all of our soldiers over there. If you remember, we had these soldiers that were making deals with local warlords to get kilos of white heroin, put in body bags of dead soldiers and bring them back. So that's a whole nother story there, man.
It's kind of interesting, though. Like you just said, I mean, the French mobsters already initially had deals to bring heroin over from the Golden Triangle over in Asia. That closes down when France is out of Vietnam, basically the end of the 50s, which is about the same time. 57 is when this meeting takes place. So 57, 58 is when they decide, well, this old heroin route is closing down, so we need to set something else up new. So that's where they sort of established this route from Turkey to Marseille to Canada. It's how the criminal world evolves based on the political situation. That France was leaving Vietnam, so they moved into, so we'll grow our heroin in Turkey, and then it's incredible how adaptive these guys are.
Really, that's great insight. I didn't quite put that together, but that's great. And you know, Cam, I mentioned Tommaso Bruschetta, and I didn't really say who he was, but everybody knows these other names, and you're going to learn a lot more about Tommaso Bruschetta. There's a movie coming out called The Traitor. It's actually Italian made. It's going to have subtitles, and they say it's
real really good documentary on Netflix right now.
There's a great documentary on Netflix and on YouTube. But this Tommaso Bruschetta. So he was the first. Yeah, he was the first. Just a real quick, he was the first Italian mafiosi, Sicilian mafiosi, who ever informed, and he was a really high-ranking figure. So that'll sort of give you some context before we do an episode on him in the future. But he was the first high-ranking Sicilian mafiosi who informed, and his business was international. He was right up to his elbows in this heroin shipping, and he really brought a lot of things down in the 80s when he informed. But so yeah, when just the cliff notes there. Right. We're going to do a whole show on Tommaso, because he's a pretty important character. In this absolutely. Story. And you've done a hell of a lot of research on him. So he tells when he turns and starts testifying more up in the 80s. He tells a story here that back in those days in 1957, that's when Joe Bonanno and Carlo Gambino and Carmine Galante came over. They had kind of a summit, a little mini summit with Sicilians. And they said that Bruschetta later claimed that Joe Bonanno advised the Sicilians they need to form a commission like they have in New York to settle disputes because they're always fighting with each other.
Yeah.
You can't make any money when you're trying to kill each other off, but these are men of honor. It's different over there. We'll talk more about that, but it's totally different over there than it is over here. This men of honor thing.
Like what you said with Mussolini. I mean, Mussolini stepped on that guy's toes, and that guy felt, and so that guy stepped on Mussolini's toes, and then you've got the whole mob shut down over some hurt feelings.
And so Mussolini stepped back with a bigger boot.
That was just over some honor bullshit.
It's crazy, and you'll really find out how crazy it gets when we start talking about Bruschetta and what happened to him and his family over that. But according to Bruschetta, this was in a private room at the Spano Seafood Restaurant in Palermo. Lucky Luciano was there. Of course, he has to live in Italy by this time, and he hosts the meeting. And he recognized Joe Bonanno and Carmine Galante. There were some other people from the United States there, and then all the major mafia bosses in Sicily. And the most important one, I won't bore you with all these names because you've never heard of them, but the most important ones were Gaetano Badalamenti and Tommaso Bruschetta. And I think this Filippo and Vincenzo Remi. But then there were several others.
Yeah, those are the big dogs, Luciano and Bonanno and Galante, who we know from this side, and then over there, the Badalamenti and Bruschetta, who are the big figures we're going to get into.
Really, and actually, the Italian police wiretapped that and sent a report to the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in Washington. And I have to add, Bill Owsley, my FBI agent friend's done a lot of mob research, says you really want to research the mob prior to Appalachian.
Anslinger's organization.
Go after Federal Bureau of Narcotics records in this Harry Anslinger. They really went after him.
That Who's Who that came out in the 50s, I don't know if you've seen it. It was issued prior to Appalachian, and it's basically a picture book, and it's almost like a book of mugshots.
Yeah.
And it's a list of every mobster, everything going back to between 1920 and the 1950s, I think. You can get it on Amazon. I've got an order. I've got one reserved. I think I need to get it, but it's got pictures and it's got sort of a breakdown. Their rap sheet, and it was put together by Anslinger's people because Hoover's people weren't doing anything with the mafia. It didn't exist at the time, and so Anslinger was sending people over there and checking out their trade routes, and he had people undercover in Italy and in Turkey looking to see, so he had this scoped, and there's a real thick book you can get. I'll look it up and I'll send it. Maybe we can post a picture of it.
Okay, I'll do that. Yeah, I'll do that. So is at this meeting, we're pretty sure Joe Bonanno and Carmine Galante and Carlo Gambino would have met Gaetano Badalamenti and Tommaso Bruschetta, and really the seeds for what would become the pizzaconnection heroin distribution ring were planted. Bonanno was still, he'd already assigned Carmine Galante to connect with the Cotroni family up in Montreal. I couldn't think of that earlier when I said Carmine Galante was up in Montreal, but it was a Cotroni family. And he'd already set up a distribution, like you said, the French Connection distribution through Montreal down to New York City, which was the French Connection case. Nicolo and Vito Rizzuto, who have come over here from Sicily a long time back, when Mussolini was putting them all in jail. And they end up in a mob battle with Cotroni family, and they end up taking over, but they just take over all the heroin route and all those connections and continue right on. And they really work closely. If you remember, Rizzuto ends up going to jail for helping Joe Messina with a hit out of the Bonanno family. And so they really are closely connected. They're up to their eyeballs in heroin distribution during this time.
That's right. That's exactly right. The Bonanos have always been there, and they were considered basically the wealthiest family, and a lot of people complained about Joe Bonanno setting up his flags. They said everywhere, up in Montreal and in California, but it was basically because he was building his heroin network, and the reason he had they weren't maybe necessarily in size wise larger, but they were absolutely the wealthiest family because it was heroin everywhere. It was heroin was their key moneymaker. And you read Joe Bonanno's book, and I don't know anything about it, but heroin was the Bonanno mainstay.
Interesting. And these guys all along, they're saying in 1957, they're saying we're not dealing narcotics,
right.
not dealing narcotics. But that's when they started developing this little subterfuge of using these Sicilians, using other people to handle a lot of this stuff. And when they get popped, why they don't really can't connect them back directly. Can't say that's part of the family. And nobody was a storyteller back then. Joe Valachi, but he didn't know enough to connect these dots up. He knew there was connections up to Canada, but he didn't really know enough about that to tell anybody.
Yeah.
But nobody was talking, and they had these extra people who weren't really made guys, or maybe from Sicily, are doing all this narcotics business. And historically, they primarily have brought it in to New York City, and then it goes out to the black community, because primarily in most big cities, heroin is the black drug. Heroin is the drug of choice for black folks. Heroin's not really the drug of choice for white folks. That would be more marijuana and higher end that get into the cocaine and pills and things like that, some different kinds of pills. But heroin was always huge in the black community. So that was their routes, and that's what they did. They had this all set up by the 60s. They've got these routes rolling, running and gunning with them. Now, in Sicily, we got some problems during this time. They have the first of three major Sicilian mafia wars. Now, these guys, they formed a commission, but right after they formed their commission, it blows up on them.
Yeah, and that was Luciano went over there and tried to help them, say, look, guys, you can't make any money, like you just said. You can't make any money if you're killing each other, but it didn't seem to stick with the Sicilians.
Just a little background on the guy we're going to be talking a lot more about, the one who ends up being the main stick on the Pizza Connections. It's this Gaetano Badalamenti. We also will learn more about him because I have a guy we're going to interview on the podcast who was in the penitentiary with Badalamenti after he fell on the Pizza Connection. He can tell us a little more personal stuff about this guy, but he was a big time mafia boss. He started out, of course, as the underboss or the helper to a guy named Cesare Manzella from a small town called Sinisi, Sicily. I wonder where that is. Cinisi.
Check my map.
It's probably somewhere around that Castellamarese del Golfo.
Yeah,
I would imagine. But anyhow, in that town, and Sinisi, there was an airport in that town, and they used that. Yeah,
the Palermo. It's up on the.
It's up by Palermo.
Yeah, it's right up by Palermo. It's on. There's a little outcropping, so it's
okay. That's what I thought. Almost like a suburb of Palermo, probably.
Yes.
There was this huge battle at this point in time, and they couldn't get it settled by their new commission. It was missing heroin, and nobody would take credit for it. Nobody would own up to it, and somebody feels disrespected out of this. And in this first mafia war, they start killing each other off, and now as it happens between these two families, the Greco and Manzella family, which is Badalamenti family, as they're killing each other off, later on, it comes out that actually somebody stole this heroin, was somebody from one of the other families who wanted to take down everybody. So he pitted them against each other, a guy named Michelle Capetillo. So I don't know.
And they basically had a meeting, right, where they had a meeting with the commission. The commission decided, well, there's two people. It's going to be, the commission made a ruling, and they didn't like the ruling, so they still went to war, basically, right?
Right.
Whereas,
yeah, you're right. I forgot about that.
The Italian, think about the American mafia. You hear about sit downs. If there's a dispute, the sit down is a pretty important thing. I've heard from a lot of these guys. I mean, if you have a sit down, a sit down is very competitive, but that ruling is sacrosanct. You stick with that ruling, and that's why these guys want to win. But you don't get the ruling, and then, you don't like the way that it goes, so you just kill everybody involved. I mean, that's kind of where you see the difference between the Sicilian mafia and how the American mafia work. Is there is a sense of more, I don't know about rule of law, but there is a sense that there has to be order. Whereas, like you've said, in the Sicilians, it's my honor, and I don't give a damn about money or anything else. If my honor has been slighted, then I'm going to go to the mattresses, and I don't care about anything.
Really, and these guys were bad, and this whole thing here caused a real kerfuffle, shall we say? It's a real interesting little word to use on a big mob. Manzella, who was Balamente's boss, they strike at him first. There was another family, a La Barbara family, struck at Manzella first with a huge car bomb. They said that they found pieces of his body stuck up in trees hundreds of feet away from the crater. They're bad. They're bad on these huge big car bombs. Later on, we're talking about the famous anti-mafia judge Giovanni Falcone, and they used a huge bomb to blow him up.
Yeah.
So then,
don't care about the collateral damage over there.
Right. So somebody creates another bomb that's kind of overkill. And on June the 30th, 1963, on June the 30th, 1963, an unknown caller called the cops and talked about there's a bomb in a little car that's waiting to kill one of the La Barbara families. And
tipped them off.
Actually, I'll take that back. Okay. And on June the 30th, 1963, an unknown caller calls the local Italian police in Sicily about a car bomb that's sitting there. And supposedly it's to kill another boss named Salvatore Greco. And it's in revenge for the last bombing. Well, this is a huge car bomb, and the local Carabini try to defuse it. Don't try to defuse a bomb. No. Although this one, I don't know what they would have done. It exploded and killed 7 police officers in Siraculi, which is Siraculi was a suburb of Palermo. In the beginning, this became known as the Siraculi massacre, which was the people were outraged. It made the local people turn on the mafia, whereas they maybe would put up with a lot or just turn a blind eye. They have this thing. Right now we've got this quarantine going on over in Sicily or over in Italy, and they say they're asking people to not practice this tradition they have of trying to avoid whatever the government wants you to do in any way. If it's a small thing and there's not a big penalty for it, you're maybe not going to jail. You just always try to avoid whatever the central government wants you to do. And they're asking them to don't avoid this, stay in your quarantine.
This one time,
this one time.
Don't try and keep it under the radar.
But after this, after 7 police officers were killed, you can imagine what happened, can't you, Cam?
Yeah, shit. I imagine they cracked down, kind of like. I imagine, yeah, they unloaded that. They brought them all down. The whole. Oh yeah, the guards came tumbling down.
They went after everybody, and that's when a lot of them went abroad, and many of them to South America, and that's where Tommaso Bruschetta. He takes off and goes to Brazil, and kind of becomes his base for a while. He will operate around the world in different places, but mainly he'll be in and out of Brazil. And that's next week we're going to take a lot closer look at his life. And this did disrupt the heroin trade to the United States. How the law enforcement found out, but those guys, several of them, Badalamenti went to South America also. They kind of regrouped down there and just started going back into it, trying to get their smuggling routes back in kind of a different way. Because you still got that's when they really changed to the mid East after 1957. As you said, the French are going out of Indochina and they move into the Mid East and set up these routes from Sicily to Sardinia, Canada, and then down to New York. And they're already connected up with the Bonanno family.
Whenever you see this Ceausescu, this massacre you were just talking about, whenever you see anything like this and a bunch of cops get involved, that's when it ends. As I was trying to think something comparable in America, I would the only thing like the Kansas City massacre or something that was where the bank robbers were sort of like the heroes, the folk heroes, until they there's a whole station full of cops and officers and things, and then sort of the tide changed. And I guess that's kind of how it was here. Is we didn't really think of the mafia as anything, but then once there's a big wipeout of police and legitimate people, then the tide sort of changes. And like you said, it did shut things down for a while.
Oh yeah, that's a good analogy. It's an analogous situation was the Kansas City massacre, where you killed, I think, 2 Kansas City policemen and a FBI agent. I mean, the shit hit the fan, as they say. Mm-hmm. And they were popping these guys everywhere. They were going after them, and people weren't hiding them anymore like they once did. Because even the citizens that might normally look at these guys as some kind of Robin Hoods or something were not going to put up with it anymore. And that was really the beginning to the end. By 1935, they were all dead.
All dead. So I mean, I guess that's kind of the same as what happened with this first mob war. As long as they're sort of keeping it amongst themselves and keeping us out of it's just the mafia. But then once you start killing cops and people, that's it.
Yeah, you're dead. Bonnie and Clyde situation. They killed 2 Texas state troopers just before that last ambush. And all they did was they caught them in that ambush in that kill zone and just opened up on them with VARs and shotguns. And they didn't even, in that one movie that was on Netflix, they kind of acted like they flagged them down. The highwayman tried to flag them down. They didn't try to flag them down. I can promise you that. We had an FBI agent get killed. It was actually turned out it was a street crime in the 70s here in Kansas City. And I'll tell you what, you talk about, we didn't know why he got killed. He was in town from out of town on another case. It wasn't a big case, I don't think, but he just a street crime, just some street kid tried to rob him as he walked back. He'd been downtown at a restaurant or something, or a bar a little bit late in the evening. He's walking back by himself to his hotel, and they tried to rob him on the street, and he ended up getting killed. I don't know if he tried to pull his gun or what happened, but boy, I tell you what, the FBI, they pulled out all stops. I'd hate to imagine how much money they spent on that investigation. It lasted about 4 days, and they were so angry they wouldn't really even work with us.
It's personal,
and the homicide were at each other's throats. The homicide squad were at each other's throats, trying to get clues and not tell the other one, because that was personal for those agents. I happened to be up their office during that time, and in one hallway there's about 10 big boxes, and this was just when personal computers were starting to get used by people. It was like these were all brand new personal computers that, I tell you what, as soon as this thing hit, anything they wanted, they got. I don't know how much money they spent on that one, but you got to do what you got to do.
Yeah.
So anyhow, this kind of gets us up to when the Pizza Connection starts. That's kind of the history, I'd say, of how these guys came together and how they, started to do this thing together that would become the Pizza Connection case.
Heroin was kind of became big business, and they finally got real organized. We'll cover.
Right, and the old connections. That's always important to me. How did these guys end up together? know, and you go look back, you see they're at the same meetings. Badalamenti and Bruschetta, and he'll verify a lot of this later on. They're at the same meeting with Bonanno and Gambino and Carmine Galante back in 1957.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden they end up with this huge heroin conspiracy 20 years later. So it started way back then. So I always appreciate the history of things and how it came to be. During those days, Italian law enforcement did not take them all that seriously before this massacre. And it really kind of let them get out of hand. But finally, the FBI found an old 1963 report that the Italian police had kept kind of, confidential. And they learned a lot of this about the existence of a commission, and that there were 6 bosses from Palermo, and there are 9 other bosses from the rest of the small towns around Sicily. So if you think about it, that's like 6, 9, and that's like 15 separate little families there in Sicily. And
Sicily's a small place too.
It's not that big. It's not that big. The mafia, the difference in the mafia in Sicily and the Camorra, which is more up in the mainland, up around Naples, Neapolitan, is the Camorra is more they have these separate families, but neither one is in a pyramid over the other.
Yeah.
The Sicilian mafia has more of a pyramid structure, and that's why they like to have this boss of bosses and the commission, and so they work in more of a pyramid, and so they start discovering all these things, working with the Sicilian, and that's not particularly just Sicilian, but the Italian police, and trying to put it together. It's a hard fought deal to get them to trust the FBI to trust them.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of corruption over there also, but during this time, it'll start coming out that it is a hierarchical structure, like I said, with a boss and underboss and capos, and the order goes out from up on high, and it gets carried out on the lower level just because the boss gave the order. Everybody thinks that's that's the way it is. But see, when you're trying to build a case on somebody, you want to convict somebody of these things. Well, if you only find the guy that does the shooting, then you didn't do anything.
Yeah.
Or if you only take out the mid-level guy, then it doesn't do anything because you've already got this hierarchy set up. You have to attack
the next guy like Shark's
right.
Teeth. This next one's just going to flip into place.
You got to attack it as a whole, and to do that, you got to be able to prove that there's a hierarchical structure, and that when somebody up high gives an order, then it drifts down to whoever ends up carrying it out, the actual crime on the street. Many times it was Carmine Galante. He isn't doing any crime.
Yeah.
He just tells people to do stuff. He just puts connections together. And this Tommaso Bruschetta was one of the first guys, was definitely the first guy in Sicily to come in and talk about this theory of organization. So then your prosecutor can take a guy like Tommaso, like we've done it in the United States with Ken Ito up in Chicago. He would go around to different trials and testify, this is how it works. There was Angelo Leonardo may have done that. And
Leonardo, his testimony, he talks about, in the East Coast, you can read his exact statement. He talks about, in the East Coast, there's 5 families in New York, and my family's with the Genovese. But then in Chicago, they have their own commission where everybody. So he breaks it down very well,
right.
talking about the families out west and how they have their own commission, but they also work with the East Coast. And Leonardo breaks it down just incredibly. If you can find a copy of his statement,
I have to look that
very
up.
Thorough.
Yeah,
very thorough.
I've seen the copy of his script on what the script was, shall we say, when he was sworn in, was made a made guy. It's pretty interesting. He kind of wrote it down word for word. But get back to Sicily, nobody believed any of this, and when Tommaso Bruschetta came in, who we're going to deal with next week in his life, he told them about it, and they started using him as a storyteller so they could get the bosses too, and the intermediate managers and the lower guys. and take out the whole organization. And they even called this new thing that they nenever used before the bruschetta theorem. So I'd never heard that before.
Yeah, no, I hadn't heard that.
The government, Sicilian or Italian government gave this a name, the bruschetta theorem. So that's the theory of how the mob works.
The hierarchical structure of the mob.
Right, exactly. All right, let's tune in next week, and we'll kind of talk a lot more about Tommaso Bruschetta. And don't forget, there's going to be a movie called The Traitor, and there's a really good documentary about him out there. So you need The Godfather. Is that the name of it?
Our Godfather.
Our Godfather.
Our Godfather.
That's a documentary, isn't it? Yes, it's a great documentary. It's really interesting. And The Traitor is the name of the narrative movie that'll be coming out. Have you heard anything more about that? I keep looking for it.
No, I've not. I haven't, but I need to do some more Google for it. But yeah, I did see that was coming.
I haven't Googled for it. They were going to do a screening or a talk about it at the Mob Museum, the last I heard. And I think it'd been released in maybe like New York and LA. You know, us in the Midwest, we don't get those things for a long time, many times. Sometimes we never get movies. So go ahead, Cam. You got anything to add?
No. I'm good. I'm just this is kind of like the Skim trial. It reminds me. It's just how intricate these connections are, and what a massive conspiracy was going on. And it's just really, things like this are really incredible when you look at them in context of what these criminal organizations were able to put together. Kind of like with the Skim that you dealt with years ago. It's just these massive tens of millions of dollars worth of goods and services being misappropriated, and it's just a massive business they're putting together. It's really interesting to me.
And they keep everybody in line. They keep it moving. They keep it working. And these are not PhDs from Harvard or Yale. These are just men with a lot of native intelligence, a lot of charisma, and an ability to override their conscience.
Yeah, right. That's that last one that's important.
That's a kind way of putting that, isn't it?
That's very diplomatic.
He's not a sociopath, he just has an ability to override his conscience. Everything he learned in catechism school, he's able to override that.
I like that.
All right. Let's wind this down. If folks, one of you listeners out there, you know somebody that's a veteran, and you believe that you as a veteran, a former vet, might have a problem that is connected to PTSD, and it's connected to your service, which is going to be, contact a local vet center or a vet hospital, VA hospital in your area, or there's a national hotline out there, 1-800-273-8255, and be sure to press 1 if you're a vet. Or you can go to the VA, the government website that has a lot of really good resources. It's www.ptsd.va.gov. I appreciate it. Don't forget to take a look at my website and subscribe to it. I never ask anybody to subscribe to it. Probably everybody that knows the podcast has already subscribed to it, because you get in your email when this comes out and this podcast comes out, you get an email right to your inbox. And on the website, you can make a donation. By the way, you can, if you get $25 or more, I'll give you either one of my movies or the book or the Kindle copy of the book. I get you a certificate that you can turn in for a Kindle copy of the book. On the other side, if you don't really want to go to the website, or you happen to have your phone in your hand, you think of it, and you got a Venmo app, hit me up on Venmo for $1 or $2. Buy me a cup of coffee and shot in a beer. It's Jinx Law. And got my Kansas City Mob Tour app. I got anything else I'm selling? I can't think of anything.
I can't.
About you, Cam?
You got your hands full. No, I don't. I've got a few things I would like to sell. I gotta find the people to sell them to.
I know what you mean, brother. All right. Good night, Cam.
Take care, Gary.
All right.